The city of Natchitoches is under investigation by the Louisiana Board of Ethics.
And now Mayor Ronnie Williams is speaking out about how the situation came about and what it means for the city moving forward. Our Davion Telsey sat exclusively with the mayor.
You know, when you haven't done anything wrong, you don't mind being investigated. So, and that's what we feel is the case here.
Mayor Ronnie Williams confirms he was formally notified by the Louisiana Board of Ethics in September of 2025. He says he received a letter informing him that the board was investigating certain matters involving his administration. According to the mayor, at least 3 other individuals also received similar notices.
The ethics process is a legitimate process. However, it's been known to be used as a political tool against somebody's political opponent.
In response to public reporting by other media outlets about the investigation, Mayor Williams sent a letter disputing what he called false or misleading narratives surrounding the city and its grant writer. In that letter, the mayor states that the city proactively sought guidance from the Board of Ethics months before any investigation was publicly known, calling the move an effort to ensure compliance, not evidence of wrongdoing.
Before we knew this investigation was going on, we actually sought the ethics board opinion on whether or not the grant writer, who is paid a salary by the city, but can that person also be paid through the grant funds to administer the grant? And there's some language out there that suggested that it could happen. So we were talking internally. We said, hey, well, let's get the ethics board to give us clarity on that.
The mayor also pushed back against claims that employment changes were made to shield the grant writer from council approval. He says those assertions misrepresent city policy and state law, noting that the position in question did not require council confirmation.
Well, here's what I'll say about the grant writer, and she's taken a lot of political hits really since we brought her in, and I have to commend her, Nicole Gray, because she's basically kept her head down. She's brought a lot of money into the city.
Mayor Williams says his administration has been transparent and cooperative throughout the process. He adds that today's interview is about correcting the record, addressing what he believes is inaccurate reporting, and giving the public a clearer understanding of how the ethics review came about.
Don't take their word for it, because time and time again, this particular news company is really not news. They have a political agenda. The editor told me himself, and he doesn't care if he's divisive. He doesn't care about Natchitoches growing. He doesn't have that care or concern about the well-being of Natchitoches. He just has one goal: to hurt me politically.
The Board of Ethics has not released additional details. The investigation remains ongoing. In Natchitoches, for News Channel 5, I'm Davion Telsey.